NOAA just told 60 million Americans living on the Gulf Coast that this hurricane season will be quiet. Below normal, fewer storms, less risk. They are not wrong about the numbers. But there is something in the water right now that the storm count doesn't capture. And if a single hurricane finds it before it makes landfall, the cities most at risk won't have enough time to react. Here is what forecasters are actually watching. And here is why the cities they are most worried about are not the ones you'd expect. The Gulf of Mexico is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet's oceans. Since the summer of 2012, sea surface temperatures in the Gulf have climbed at roughly double the pace of global ocean warming. Records were set in the Gulf in back-to-back years, and near-record warmth has carried into this season. As of this spring, temperatures in the Gulf were running more than 1 degree Celsius above the long-term average, tied with the warmest ever recorded for that time of year. That number matters more than the seasonal storm count. Here is why. When a hurricane crosses cold or shallow water, its own winds churn up colder water from the depths, which acts as a natural brake on intensification. The storm stirs up its own competition. But when the warm water extends deep, 100 meters or more below the surface, there is no cold water to churn up. The hurricane's winds simply stir more warm water into itself, and the storm explodes. This phenomenon has a name. Forecasters call it rapid intensification. The official definition is a storm that gains at least 35 miles per hour in wind speed within 24 hours. In practice, it means a storm that goes to sleep as a tropical storm and wakes up as a Category 3 hurricane, sometimes faster than that. 5 of the 10 continental United States landfalling hurricanes that rapidly intensified by at least 40 miles per hour in the day before landfall have happened in the last 9 years. Not the last 50, not the last 20, the last 9. The Gulf is the reason, and right now the Gulf is loaded. The loop current, a powerful ribbon of warm Caribbean water that enters the Gulf through the Yucatan Channel, shed a warm core ring earlier this year and is already in regrowth phase, extending northward again. When that current releases another eddy during the peak of hurricane season, it drops a pool of deep, warm water directly in the path of any storm tracking toward the northern Gulf Coast. That pool acts like rocket fuel. Once the storm drives over it, the brakes are gone. AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert has already flagged rapid intensification as the single most dangerous variable of the season. Not because it is guaranteed to happen, because when it happens near a coastline, the warning timeline collapses. Hurricane Michael, in a year that was also supposed to be a quieter season, went from a tropical depression to a Category 5 landfall in 3 days. Much of that intensification happened in the final 24 hours. Mexico Beach, Florida had almost no time to react. The storm arrived as something entirely different from what the forecast had said it would be. That is the scenario forecasters are watching for right now. Not a slow, trackable storm that gives the coast a week to prepare. A storm that looks manageable at noon on Tuesday and makes Category 4 landfall before midnight on Wednesday. So which cities are most exposed? AccuWeather's landfall risk analysis for this season zeroes in on a specific corridor, the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, and both Carolinas on the Atlantic side. These are the areas where the combination of Gulf water temperatures, loop current behavior, and this year's expected positioning of the Bermuda High creates the highest probability of a direct hit. New Orleans sits at an average elevation of 6 feet below sea level. The levee system rebuilt after Katrina was designed for a specific storm profile, not for a rapid intensification event that arrives stronger than projected. Biloxi, Mobile, Pensacola. These are cities where storm surge from a fast-moving, unexpected Category 4 can outpace evacuation orders by hours. The Carolinas carry a different risk. Hurricane Helene in 2024 showed exactly what happens when a Gulf Coast landfall sends moisture thousands of miles inland. That storm was no longer carrying hurricane-force winds when it arrived in western North Carolina and southwestern Virginia. It didn't matter. The rainfall it produced caused flooding that killed more than 200 people in communities that had never considered themselves hurricane country. The mountains didn't protect them. They funneled the water. That same pattern, a storm making landfall on the coast, then driving catastrophic rainfall hundreds of miles inland, is what forecasters describe as the most underestimated threat in the country right now. The impacts don't stop at the coast. They never did. Here is the specific danger of a below-normal forecast in a year when the Gulf is this warm. A below-normal season suppresses preparation. People who live on the Gulf Coast check the forecast, see that NOAA is calling for fewer storms than average, and make a calculation. They stock fewer supplies. They delay evacuation planning. Some of them decide not to board the windows when a storm is still 72 hours out and still looks manageable. That calculation is rational based on the number. It is dangerous based on the water. Because El Niño, the atmospheric pattern that is expected to suppress overall storm formation this season, does not eliminate rapid intensification. It reduces the number of storms that form. But if even one storm forms during a window of low wind shear and tracks over deep warm Gulf water, El Niño is irrelevant. The water underneath that storm doesn't know what the seasonal outlook said. The 1992 hurricane season was an El Niño year. The entire season produced only one major hurricane. That hurricane was Andrew. It formed in mid-August, made a direct hit south of Miami, and became the costliest hurricane in American history at the time. One storm, below normal season, catastrophic outcome. NOAA's own director said it directly at the forecast press conference. It only takes one. What forecasters are not saying, but what the data supports, is that the one storm this season most needs to avoid is a track through the northern Gulf in the window before El Niño fully develops. That window runs roughly through the first half of the season. The peak of hurricane season runs from mid-August through mid-October. El Niño's suppressive effect is expected to build through that same window, which means the early part of the season, before El Niño locks in, carries the highest probability of an unchecked rapid intensification event over deep Gulf water. That window is open right now. The Gulf is loaded with warm water. The loop current is in a configuration that favors releasing another warm eddy. The early season window before El Niño's wind shear kicks in fully is exactly when a storm would have the fewest atmospheric obstacles and the most oceanic fuel. NOAA is not wrong. The season will likely produce fewer named storms than average. But the question that matters for the 60 million people living in the hurricane impact zone is not how many storms form. It is whether the one that finds the Gulf finds it the way it is right now, warm, deep, and loaded. The season is not quiet. The Gulf is not quiet. And the cities in the path of what this water can produce are running out of the time they need before that window closes. To understand why rapid intensification is so much more dangerous than a slow-building storm, you have to understand what happens to an evacuation order when the forecast changes overnight. A major hurricane landfall requires roughly 72 hours of lead time for a full coastal evacuation. That is not a number chosen arbitrarily. It is based on the physical reality of moving millions of people off a coastline on a finite number of roads, most of which run parallel to the coast before they turn inland. New Orleans sits at the end of a peninsula. Galveston sits on a barrier island. When a storm is tracking toward those cities, the evacuation routes become gridlocked within hours, and the math of moving people requires that the order go out early, before the storm has revealed its final intensity. Rapid intensification breaks that math. When a storm is a Category 1 36 hours before landfall, emergency managers face a choice that has no good answer. Issue a maximum evacuation order for a storm that looks manageable, and risk the public tuning out future warnings when the storm ends up weaker than projected. Or wait for confirmation of intensification before ordering evacuation, and discover that by the time the order goes out, the window has closed. Hurricane Laura in 2020 intensified from a Category 1 to a Category 4 in less than 24 hours before making landfall near Lake Charles, Louisiana. The storm surge it produced was 15 feet in some areas, higher than the projections that had been communicated to residents who had decided to shelter in place based on the earlier forecast. The difference between a 15-foot surge and a 12-foot surge is not 3 feet of additional water. It is the difference between a house that floods and a house that disappears. And Hurricane Laura happened in a year when Gulf water temperatures were not at the levels they are sitting at right now. The loop current's behavior this season makes this specific risk measurable. When the loop current sheds a warm core eddy, a clockwise rotating ring of warm water that breaks off from the main current and drifts slowly west-southwest toward Texas and Louisiana, it deposits a reservoir of deep warm water directly in the historical path of Gulf tracking storms. The eddy released earlier this year is doing exactly that. And the loop current is already in regrowth phase, which means the probability of it releasing another eddy during the peak of hurricane season is elevated. 2 warm eddies in the Gulf during peak season. 1 storm that finds them. That is the scenario that keeps Gulf Coast emergency managers awake at night. Not a dramatic Category 5 forming in the open Atlantic with 10 days of forecast lead time. A storm that organizes late, tracks into the Gulf during a window of low wind shear, drives over deep warm water, and arrives at the coast as something that the 48-hour forecast never suggested it would be. 5 of the 10 fastest intensifying continental U.S. landfalling hurricanes in recorded history have happened in the past 9 years. Before that, such events were rare. Forecasters attribute the acceleration directly to the Gulf's warming trend. Since 2012, the Gulf has warmed at roughly double the pace of the global ocean. That trend is not reversing. If anything, the loop current's current regrowth phase suggests the deep warm water that enabled those 5 events is still there, still building, and positioned to intercept whatever forms in the right location. Here is what this means for the specific communities most at risk. The Florida Panhandle, Panama City, Pensacola, Fort Walton Beach, sits directly in the northeastern Gulf Coast exposure corridor that AccuWeather has identified as the highest risk zone for this season. These are communities that were largely spared by the track of major recent storms, which gave some residents a false sense of security. Mexico Beach, a small community on the Panhandle coast, was essentially erased by Hurricane Michael. The community had roughly 48 hours of warning before Michael made its unprecedented Category 5 landfall. Many residents who stayed did so based on forecasts that showed a strong but manageable storm, not what Michael had become by the time it crossed the beach. The Alabama coast, Biloxi and Gulfport in Mississippi, and the Louisiana coast from Lake Charles through Grand Isle represent communities that sit at or near sea level, depend on a limited number of evacuation routes, and have populations with high rates of residents who lack the financial means to evacuate when the order comes. Research on Hurricane Katrina found that evacuation compliance in New Orleans was lowest in neighborhoods with the lowest incomes, not because those residents didn't understand the danger, but because they had nowhere to go and no means to get there. That demographic reality has not changed. The Carolinas represent a different but equally serious exposure. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are among the most vulnerable barrier island chains on the East Coast, with a permanent population that swells to several times its normal size during summer tourism season, exactly the period when early season storms would make landfall. Hurricane Florence in 2018 made landfall as a Category 1, but produced catastrophic inland flooding that killed 34 people and caused $24 billion in damage. The storm's rainfall, not its winds, drove most of the deaths and most of the cost. NOAA's forecast, Colorado State University's forecast, and every other seasonal outlook published this year agrees on the broad picture. Below normal storm count, El Niño suppression, fewer named systems. None of those forecasts can tell you what happens when a storm finds the Gulf the way it is right now. The water in the Gulf of Mexico this season is warmer than it has been for most of recorded history. The loop current is positioned to amplify that warmth during the peak months. The warning time for rapid intensification events near the coast is measured in hours, not days. And the 60 million people living in the coastal impact zone from Texas to the Carolinas are about to enter the period, mid-August through mid-October, when the atmosphere